All right, folks, welcome to our next unit in human biology. We're in chapter 7, the nervous system, and more specifically, nervous tissue. This is all the cells and tissues which makes up your nervous system. Remember, you got the central nervous system, which is made up of your brain and spinal cord. And then you also have the peripheral nervous system called the PNS, which is all the nerves and neurons located outside the brain and spinal cord. So the brain and spinal cord is the central nervous system, the CNS, and everything outside the brain and spinal cord is the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. All right, so here's the learning objectives for Chapter 7, Nervous Tissue. So in about, 5-6 weeks when we take our next exam, these are the 9 things that you should be able to identify or explain. Number 1, list the general functions of the nervous system. Pretty easy. We're going to go over that today. 2, explain the structural and functional classifications of the nervous system. So there's different branches of the nervous system. I already said central nervous system versus peripheral nervous system, but there's a lot of other little different branches. Okay, 3, distinguish between the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, all the nerves and neurons outside of the brain and spinal cord. 4, this is going to be kind of a tough part. Describe the structures and functions of neuroglial cells. These are like little cells that are like little helpers for the neurons. Neurons are the main structural cell or unit of the nervous system, but they also have little helpers called glial cells, and you'll learn about 6 or 7 of those. 5, describe the structure of a neuron and its important anatomical regions. If you've taken AP psychology, I'm guessing you guys went over the structure of usually like a multipolar neuron. 6, distinguish between white matter and gray matter. That's pretty easy. I can probably explain that in about 15 seconds. 7, classify neurons by structure and function. We'll go over that. 8, list the types of general sensory receptor and their functions. So sensory receptors and their functions. And 9, describe the events that lead. This will be probably the most complicated one. Describe the events that lead to the generation of a nerve impulse, also called an action potential, and its conduction or its transmission, its movement from one neuron to another. All right, so a little introduction. The nervous system is the control and communication center of the body. So it's like the telephone wires, that allow you to communicate with, people around town. The telephone wires. Now we don't usually talk through regular telephones anymore, but the nervous system and their neurons are kind of like little telephone wires that allow your brain and the rest of your body, the brain to talk to your body and your body to talk to the brain. And it's got a homeostatic role. Remember homeostasis. So it's kind of in charge of making sure that there's a balance within the body with all the different systems, pH, blood glucose, temperature, all that. And it communicates with the body via fast electrical signals. So the nervous system happens very fast. So it's like sending a text message. When you hit send, it's instantaneous. Your friend within a second is going to get a little bleep bleep on their phone and they got a text message. And it kind of works hand in hand with the endocrine system. So the endocrine system also plays a homeostatic role, helps to maintain homeostasis. But the endocrine is much slower. The endocrine, you guys may not have ever even done this, but the endocrine is more like putting a letter in the mail. So it's got to go through the mail. The postman's got to pick it up. He takes it, to the post office, and then it eventually arrives where it needs to go. And obviously, the endocrine doesn't use a mailman, but it uses the bloodstream. So the endocrine system uses hormones that are put in the blood, and it takes a while for those hormones to travel through the blood to its target organs or effectors. Where the nervous system, it's an electrical signal through neurons, which happens much, much faster. All right, so some basic functions of the nervous system, the 3 just very, very basic general functions. Its first one is sensory. So this is a lot like with the feedback loop when it comes to maintaining homeostasis, where the receptors notice some sort of change in the body. They send input to the brain, the control center, which is going to make some sort of decision on what best to do to maintain homeostasis. It's going to send output to the effectors, and they're going to make the desired response. So the first thing is the sensory part of the nervous system. And the receptors via, and this is a new term, afferent neurons go from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system. So this is your sensory receptors, maybe in your skin. Maybe there's a bug, crawling on your arm. And the little receptors in your skin are going to notice that bug crawling on your arm. And those are going to be afferent neurons because it's going from your arm, which is your peripheral nervous system, and it's going to send that information into your spinal cord and then the brain, central nervous system. So whenever information is going into the CNS, central nervous system, that's afferent. And then it's going to reach the integration, also called the association area. And this is where this is going to be the brain. It's going to interpret what's going on. It's going to analyze what's going on. It's going to store changes. So you'll be able to remember what's happening. So it stores memories, and then it determines what action is needed. And then when it determines what action is needed, then it's the motor output. So remember, there's input, output. So from the brain, it's going to send output, and these are going to be through efferent. So neurons which carry messages from the brain and spinal cord to your body, to the peripheral nervous system, that's efferent. So basically, if it's exiting the central nervous system, it's efferent. If it's going into the central nervous system, it's afferent. So this could be muscles, like if a bug is crawling on your arm, your response is probably going to be you're going to swat the bug away. But it'll also be to glands. If your blood glucose levels are low, it's going to send output to like your pancreas to release glucagon, which is going to then raise your blood glucose levels back up. All right, so basically this is the exactly the same as the previous slide, except very few words and more pictures. All right, so your sensory receptors, in this case it's your eyes. Oh, they see something. I don't know, maybe there's a car coming at you, and it sends that sensory input into the integration center, or the brain. Remember, this is going to be afferent, because it's going from the peripheral nervous system in your eyes, and it's going to go into the control center, or the integration or the association center, the brain. The brain's going to decide, hey, what needs to be done, and then it's going to send output to whatever muscle or gland needs to make the desired response. So if it's a car coming at you, maybe it's going to make your gastrocnemius here, make you jump out of the way. And since this one is exiting the central nervous system and going into your peripheral nervous system, this is efferent. All right, so afferent information comes into the brain and makes some sort of decision, and efferent information leaves the brain, goes through the spinal cord, and then goes through the nerves that reaches the effector that's going to make the desired response. So afferent comes in, efferent exits the central nervous system. All right, so this is basically the same. I've already gone over this. That the three, functions of the nervous system are very similar to a feedback loop. Remember, first you got sensory and a feedback loop. Some sensory receptor notice some changes in your body, sends it to the brain, the control center, which for processing and integration. The brain's going to analyze what to do, what's the best course of action. It's going to analyze the information, determine the appropriate output. And remember, when it's output, it's efferent. When it's input, it's afferent. And that's going to lead to a motor response. And two broad classifications of the nervous system. I already said it, but we'll say it again. The central nervous system. It's made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Next unit, when we're done with this nervous tissue, we'll go into the central nervous system. We're going to look at the parts of the brain. We're going to look at more in depth on the spinal cord. So this is the command center. This is what's going to do the interpreting and making the decisions. It's going to analyze the sensory information coming in. Going to make the determination of what response needs to be made. And then it's going to pass that on to the peripheral nervous system, which is all of the nerves and neurons outside of the brain and spinal cord. And then you got two little branches you have spinal nerves, which you can tell where they originate. They originate from the spinal cord. So these are the spinal cord nerves come into the spinal cord. Remember, those are afferent. Nerves leave the spinal cord. Those are efferent. And then you also have 12 cranial nerves. That's also part of your peripheral nervous system. And these are nerves that don't branch off of your spinal cord, but they branch directly off the brain. So this is the two broad classifications. You got the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, everything outside of the brain and spinal cord, all the nerves and neurons that branch off of the brain and spinal cord. All right, so the last one was the structural classification of nervous system. This is functional. So remember, you have the sensory. So that's what's analyzing what's going on. It's all the sensory receptors inside your body on the surface of your skin. And it's going to send these impulses towards the CNS. So remember, that's also called afferent. If it's going from the peripheral to the central nervous system, that's afferent. So it could be stuff like touch receptors, baroreceptors in the skin, thermoreceptors in the skin, taste buds in the tongue. That's all going to be information that's going to be sent to your brain. And now two little classifications of sensory. You got somatic. These are the things you're basically aware of. So if, like today, this girl in one of my classes, she said it was 73 degrees in there, but she says, it's burning up in there. It's hot. Well, she noticed that. Thermoreceptors in her skin told her she was hot. Maybe football players, oh, my quadricep is sore because, somebody tackled me. You're aware of that. It hurts. Maybe you have severe arthritis in your hip like I do, and it really hurts. These are all things that you're aware of. These is somatic sensory. Then you have your visceral sensory. Now, if you remember from our last unit, remember the visceral pericardium was the serous membrane that was the most deep, the closest to the heart, most deep. Now, whenever you hear the word visceral or viscera, it's always usually dealing with your organs or deep within your body. Like if someone said you had a very visceral reaction to that, that means it was like a gut reaction. It wasn't something you really thought out of. It's something that gut. It came from deep within. And then remember, you also have the motor section of the nervous system, which is also called efferent. So this is carrying impulses away from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system, to the effectors for a motor response. And remember, so these are what's exiting. If it exits the central nervous system, look at that. Exit starts with an E. And guess what? So does efferent. Efferent also starts with an E. So remember, if it's exiting the CNS, it's efferent. All right, then you have the somatic nervous system. Once again, this is under your voluntary controls. This is your controlling skeletal muscles. So if you're taking notes right now, that's a good idea. If you're taking notes and you're writing with a pencil, that's somatic nervous system. Your brain is telling your hand to write certain words or type certain words. This is not out of your control. This is totally within what you're trying to do. This is your somatic nervous system. And now that also have the autonomic nervous system. And this is involuntary. So this is stuff that just happens by itself. So this is smooth muscles. So like the muscles which line your gastrointestinal tract, like around your intestines, your stomach, cardiac muscle in your heart, and also your glands like your pancreas and your thyroid and pituitary. These are things that you do not have to think about. I mean, if we had to think about our heart pumping or our pancreas secreting glucagon to increase our blood glucose levels, there's no way we would ever learn anything in class because we'd be thinking about all these different things we got to do. But autonomic, it works all by itself. It's involuntary. And there's two classes of the autonomic nervous system. The first one is your sympathetic nervous system, otherwise called fight or flight. So this is when you're in a situation of danger. So this is what, like, if for some reason you're camping in the mountains and oh my gosh, there's a bear, or oh my gosh, there's a mountain lion. All of a sudden, your heart rate increases. Your breathing rate increases. You start to sweat. This is preparing you for either fight, which means fight the mountain lion or fight the bear, or flight, try to run away from it. So these are things. This is basically when you're nervous. Sometimes you guys will feel this before an exam. It's basically you're feeling nervous. Now for an exam, fight or flight, you're not going to fight the exam and you're not going to run from it. So this sympathetic nervous system is kind of worthless, when it comes to taking an exam. But in times of stress, your adrenal glands will release adrenaline and cortisol. It's preparing you for a very stressful situation. And the opposite of that is the parasympathetic nervous system. And they call this rest and digest. That's where it slows down the heart rate, relaxation, slows down the breathing rate, and it innervates the gut or your gastrointestinal tract because rest and digest, the digest is for when your parasympathetic nervous system is activated, that's where your food is being digested. All right, so there's just like a diagram of what we just went over in the last slide. So you got your two broad classes. You got the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. You got your peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves and neurons outside of your brain and spinal cord. Your motor division. So you have your somatic. That's skeletal muscle. This is totally voluntary. If you want to raise your hand and ask a question, that's not like involuntary. You consciously raise your hand and say, "Hey, I got a question." Then you have your autonomic division, which is involuntary. And then remember, you got the parasympathetic, which is rest and digest, which slows the heart rate down, decreases blood pressure, increases digestion. And the opposite of that is the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And this is the fight or flight. This is where you're in a time of stress, and your body is preparing you to either fight what's going on or to run away from it. So that's increased blood pressure, increased sweating, increased uh, heart rate, increased breathing. So this is the organization of the nervous system in pictorial form. And remember, sensory going to the peripheral nervous system and then to the central nervous system. Remember, that's afferent, and when it's coming out, that's efferent. All right, so not a whole lot on this. So this is our unit, nervous tissue. And it's composed of two major type of cells. The neuron, which is the major functional cell or major functional unit of the nervous system. It's the main actor. This is the star. This is your Tom Cruise, your Brad Pitt, your I don't know, Julia Roberts or whoever else is a big actor. And then you got the little supporting cast, the helpers, which is our neuroglial cells. Various type of specialized cells that are going to mainly support the neurons within the nervous system. All right, so now the glial neuroglia. Remember the supporting cells of the nervous system. They're like the little helpers of the neurons. They maintain neuron homeostasis. They're always taking care of the neurons. So general information, they look similar to neurons, I guess. This is big. They do not conduct impulses. So the neurons are the ones sending signals from your brain to the spinal cord to the rest of your body. They're sending electrochemical signals. Glial cells are not doing this. They're just supporting the neurons. The neurons are what send the signals. Glial cells are just supporting them. They are able to divide and multiply, so you can make new glial cells. For the most part, you cannot make. In some cases you can, but in most instances you can't make new neurons. That's why they say don't do drugs, because drugs kill brain cells. And sorry, can't really make new brain cells. And I forget, I guess there's 4 types in the central nervous system. Remember, CNS stands for central nervous system, and 2 different types in the peripheral nervous system. I didn't remember there was 4 and 2, but I remember what they are, but I didn't remember there was 4 and 2. All right, so your first glial cell is called an astrocyte. Astrocyte. And you're like, astro. When you think of astrology, you think of star-shaped. But most of these glial cells are kind of star-shaped, so I don't know if you'll be able to recognize it just because it's star-shaped. Anyways, all right, so its function. Number 1, forms what's called the blood-brain barrier, BBB. So this is what it blocks certain toxins, certain antibiotics from reaching the neurons in your brain. So it blocks, it's a protective barrier between the blood and the brain. It's keeping bad things outside of the brain. And it does this, you can see this. Here's a capillary right here, a blood vessel going through the brain. And then the astrocyte sends out these end feet. So you can see he's wrapping this capillary, he's sending out these end feet. And he's wrapping this capillary with his end feet like that. And that's making a protective barrier around the capillary. So it only allows certain things to come out of the capillary, come out of the blood in the capillary and go into the fluid that surrounds your neurons. So it helps to form the blood-brain barrier. I'm going to put a star next to that one because if I had to, I'm going to put a big star. If I had to guess, blood-brain barrier, that's what you're going to need to know. Astrocytes help form the blood-brain barrier. They also brace and anchor neurons to capillaries. So you can see right here that this astrocyte is this neuron right here. He's keeping it right next to the capillaries, but he's blocking. He's closing off the capillaries, so he only allows certain things to come out because he doesn't want this neuron to get damaged. Exchange nutrients between neurons and blood, so basically that's the same thing. Protect neurons from harmful substances, basically the same thing. And it controls the chemical environment of the brain, but by clearing up ions. So any excess neuronal debris or ions, the astrocytes will take care of that. But the main thing you need to know, astrocytes with their end feet surround capillaries and form the blood-brain barrier. And the next glial cell, remember the neuron's little helpers, is called a microglia. And that says this one's spider-like. Well, I mean, didn't look a whole lot different from the astrocyte, the star shape. But all right, this is the microglia. It's called a phagocyte. So it's kind of like it's basically part of your immune system. So it's constantly monitoring around neurons. So here's the neuron right here, right here. Here's the nucleus of the neuron. There's another neuron right here. So he's the one, he's cruising around. He's looking for dead cell. He's going to get rid of that debris. Also pathogens. So it's part of your immune system. So there's a pathogen, like maybe in a bacterial cell. He's going to take care of that. Also responds to injury. So he's looking for damage or problems that's going on in your nervous system, and he's going to take care of that. So he's like the immune cell that's going to take care of old cell parts. He's going to get rid of those neuronal debris and also pathogens. He's going to take care of all that. So it's kind of like the immune system for your nervous system. All right, the next glial cell, which is in your CNS glia. So remember, central nervous system glial cells is the ependymal cells. Columnar shape means they're like a column, so they're not flat like a squamous cell. They have cilia. Those are these little hairs sticking off like this, and they line up together. Their location, ventricles of the brain. So those are like spaces within the brain, the central canal of the spinal cord. But basically, their function is they produce and circulate what's called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. So they produce it, and they also circulate the cerebrospinal fluid that's found in your brain and spinal cord. So your brain is kind of floating in cerebrospinal fluid. It's floating in there within your cranium or your skull. And same thing with your spinal cord. And the cerebrospinal fluid protects the brain, so it gives it like a cushion. So if you're a football player and you make a tackle, your brain is cushioned inside that cerebrospinal fluid, and it keeps it from banging into the wall of your skull. And it also delivers nutrients to the neurons in your brain and spinal cord, and also gets rid of the things that the neurons don't need, like waste materials, like carbon dioxide that they're trying to get rid of, stuff like that. So your ependymal cells produce and circulate CSF. That's what you'll need to know. All right, the next CNS, central nervous system, glial cell, little helper for the neurons, are called oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes. I'm not a fan of this picture over here, but all right, let's see. Tentacle-like structure in which the cells form myelin sheaths around multiple nerve fiber axons. All right, so you don't really know what myelin sheaths are yet, but myelin is a fatty covering that surrounds the axons of neurons. And the myelin around the axons of neurons, so you can see, I mean, you can kind of see myelin right here, but the myelin, the nerve impulse travels down the axon. And if there's myelin on the axon, the nerve impulse travels much, much, much faster. So oligodendrocytes are able to put the myelin sheaths around, and here's the main thing, multiple nerve fibers or nerve cells, axons. So oligodendrocytes, and you can't really see it here. So this is like an axon right here, and this is the oligodendrocyte right here. And he's reaching out. And he's putting myelin around this axon from this neuron in the CNS. But he's also reaching out and putting myelin around this axon. And he's reaching out and putting myelin around this axon. So the oligodendrocyte, and we're gonna go over myelin. Don't worry, we're gonna go over that more. But oligodendrocytes put the covering, a little fatty covering, around multiple. Because I guarantee you there'll be a question. What's the difference between oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells, which will be coming up? All right, so it produces myelin, which speeds conduction of nerve impulses. So conduction is like how fast something travels. So if an axon is myelinated, the impulse or the nerve signal down the axon will travel much faster. And like I said, it's analogous, or it's kind of the same thing as Schwann cells of the PNS. But one difference is oligodendrocytes are in the CNS, central nervous system, and unlike Schwann cells, oligodendrocytes can reach out and myelinate several axons of several different neurons. And that's going to be different with Schwann cells. So oligodendrocytes are in the CNS, and they can myelinate multiple axons. All right, so very similar, but now we're out of the CNS, central nervous system. Now we're in the PNS. What does that stand for? Anybody remember? Peripheral nervous system. Everything outside of the brain and spinal cord, all the nerves and neurons. All right, so these are Schwann cells. Schwann, so it's very similar to the oligodendrocytes that were in the CNS, but this is now the PNS. All right, so you can see the Schwann cells. Well, first of all, this whole long strand here is the axon of a neuron. Axon. These are probably the dendrites right here. I'm guessing these are the dendrites. It's the receiving end. So the neuron's going to receive information here. This looks like a sensory neuron because it's unipolar neuron, and it's going to travel down the axon. But each one of these little, what looks like a sausage on a I don't know, like little links of sausage. Each one of those is a Schwann cell. Each one of those blue little circles, that's a Schwann cell. And all of those together make up the myelin sheath. So these are what's making the myelin sheath, which speeds conduction or speeds the rate of how fast the nerve impulse can travel down the axon. So when it's myelinated, the nerve impulse doesn't have to travel the entire axon. It can actually jump from each gap to gap, which makes it go much, much faster. Each one of these gaps is called a node of Ranvier. Will you need to know that? Yeah, not yet, but you will need to know that eventually. So Schwann cells, one difference between oligodendrocytes, they're not in the CNS, they're in the PNS. And if you remember, oligodendrocytes can reach out with their appendages, their little hands, and they can myelinate multiple axons on multiple neurons. That's not the case with a Schwann cell. Each one of these little blue things, that's a Schwann cell. So it can only myelinate a section of one axon on one neuron. So that's two differences. Oligodendrocytes are in the CNS, Schwann cells are in the PNS. Oligodendrocytes can myelinate several axons, where a Schwann cell can only myelinate a single segment of one axon. So each one of these little blue little ovals, that's a Schwann cell, and all those blue, that's what creates the myelin. All right, I believe this is our last glial cell, PNS, peripheral nervous system glia. Satellite cells. I'll be honest, in the past, satellite cells very rarely on our exam, but take notes on it just in case. All right, so right here is the cell body of the neuron. Looks like the same neuron. It's another unipolar neuron. We'll go over that later. The cell body is also called the soma, S-O-M-A, and you can see the satellite cells, these little gray cells that are kind of surrounding the cell body or soma. So they surround the cell body of a neuron, which is right here. Remember, this is the axon. These are the dendrites. Their function, honestly, neurologists are still trying to figure out what these guys do. But they think it protects and cushions the cell body. They also think that maybe by surrounding the cell body like that, it's going to prevent things kind of like the astrocytes with the blood-brain barrier. It protects from certain substances that are unwanted from entering the cell body or soma of the neuron. All right, so that's the satellite cells. All right, now here's the star of the show. The neurons, the functional cell or functional unit of the nervous system. So the glial cells were the helper of the neurons. The neurons are the cells that are sending the nerve impulses, or what's called action potentials, throughout the body. So it's sending them from your brain to the spinal cord to maybe the muscles in your arm to make a movement. Or maybe it's sending information from your leg to your spinal cord to your brain that says, oh, my leg is sore. So it's the neurons that are sending these electrochemical messages throughout the body. There's two major regions of a neuron. You have the cell body, which contains the nucleus of the neuron or the cell. It's the metabolic center of the cell, so it's controlling all the chemical reactions. It's controlling all the molecules, the proteins that are built. It's basically the control center of that individual cell or neuron. And then there's a bunch of processes or little branches that come off from the neuron. So you have your dendrites, which look like basically like little tree branches. That's the receiving end of a neuron. We're going to go over that in a second. And you have other branches. You have axon terminals. That's the part of the neuron that sends the signal from one neuron to another, for one neuron to maybe a muscle or gland. Neurons have a high metabolic rate. I don't remember the exact percentage, but I think it's about roughly 20% of the food you eat, the energy from the food you eat goes to your brain because your neurons require so much oxygen and so much glucose. That's the fuel. Anything that needs a lot of energy, it needs oxygen and it needs glucose. That's their fuel. And neurons are constantly working. When you're sleeping, your muscles are basically doing nothing, but your brain never goes to sleep. I mean, you may go to sleep, but your brain is always active. So it needs a constant supply of oxygen and glucose. It cannot store oxygen and glucose inside the brain. So it needs a constant supply. That's why things like a stroke, if your brain is cut off from oxygen or glucose for a very short amount of time, it leads, just a few minutes, it leads to brain death. Most neurons were formed before we were born. There are more neurons in the brain than stars in the Milky Way. You're not going to know that. And neurons live a long, long time. So these are not like like red blood cells in your blood last like a couple months. Skin cells last a couple weeks. Neurons basically last a lifetime, unless if you're one of drugs and stuff like that's what kills neurons. So you want to stay away from drugs. All right, so here's a structure of a typical neuron. This is a multipolar neuron. I'll tell you why later. But so the main structures, you can see these little branches that are branching out, these yellow branches. These are called the dendrites. That's the receiving end of a neuron. So this is what's getting stimulated. So there might be another neuron that's sending neurotransmitters, and it's striking the dendrites. That's exciting. It's exciting this neuron. It's making it more likely to fire a nerve impulse. So the dendrites are the receiving part. Here, right here in the middle, this is the soma or cell body, which contains the nucleus. This is going to be a key part right here. This little fatter region right here, just before you reach the axon. It's called the axon hillock, and this is where a nerve impulse will originate. So this is where the neuron will decide if it's going to fire an action potential or not. And you're not going to understand this right now, but I'm just going to say it anyways. This entire length right here, where the nerve impulse will travel down if an action potential is fired, that's called the axon. So this entire little tail is called the axon, which at the end you have the axon terminals. This is the like the sending part. So the dendrites are the receiving part. They receive information from another neuron, from sensory receptors, something. They receive the information. It transmits the information down the axon to the axon terminals, and then it can transmit that information to another neuron. Remember these little circles right here? That's the myelin sheath. Each one of these is the myelin sheath, which is, in this case, is the peripheral nervous system neuron because it's made by one Schwann cell. So each one of these little blue like sausages is a Schwann cell, and they all make up the myelin sheath. And then if there was the dendrites of another neuron, like right here, the next neuron. So this is the dendrites of another neuron. If an action potential, if this neuron gets stimulated enough, it's going to send a nerve impulse or an action potential. It's going to travel down the axon, and then it's going to send neurotransmitters into what's called the synapse, which could stimulate the next neuron, and then that might transmit the signal further through the nervous system, maybe to the brain. All right, so that's the structure of a typical neuron. We will be going over this more. All right, thanks for watching. I'll talk to you next time.